Good afternoon, and welcome to our Facebook Live discussion about the Boston Globe Spotlight Report, Father, My Father. I'm Scott Allen. I'm the project editor for the Boston Globe. I did a lot of work with this man sitting right next to me, Mike Rezendes, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, who is the author of this two-part series which appeared yesterday and today. And for those of you who haven't yet seen it, go to globe.com/children of priests. The whole story is right there for you to dive in very deep if you want to. I'll tell you what, I've spent a long time on this story, and I'm still absolutely fascinated by what we found, what Mike found, and all the different issues that we raised in the process. He really took an issue that nobody was paying much attention to, which is the number of kids out there whose fathers are actually Catholic priests, people who've taken a vow of celibacy and vowed that they would never have sex, let alone have children. And it turns out there are a whole lot of them out there. And Mike, really for the first time that I know of, is the first American journalist or journalist anywhere to really bring it together and get people thinking about this as a much larger and systemic issue, not just an occasional scandal. And Mike, I just want to bring you into this discussion. And I want to go back to when the very beginning of how you came to start doing this series. You know, I remember you got a call from a guy named Jim Graham in South Carolina. And I'd like you to just tell me, like, what did Jim Graham tell you, and how did it strike you at the time when you first got the information about his situation?
Sure. First, Jim emailed me with his a taste of his story. And what he said to me is a friend of his had seen the movie Spotlight. And the friend said that you ought to see this movie because you'll appreciate all the obstacles the journalists encounter dealing with the Catholic Church, because they're very similar to the obstacles you have encountered in dealing with the Catholic Church. And what happened with Jim Graham is he learned not until he was 48 years old that he might be the son of a Catholic priest. And he did a lot of research, a lot of detective work. He experienced a lot of personal pain and a lot of personal angst, and he got very little cooperation out of the Catholic Church. So Jim talked to me, of course, in addition to his email, and I was quite impressed with the experience that he had. I was quite impressed with the personal pain that he endured, and I was quite impressed with the meticulousness of the research that he had done. His work, it almost unfolded like a detective story. And I thought, gee.
He'd been raised by another man, though. And did you believe him? I mean, you know, this is a brand new issue for us.
Sure. You know, I didn't know whether to believe him or not. One thing that weighed in his favor was just the complexity of his story. It seemed to me it would be difficult, though not impossible, for someone to make up essentially a small ocean of detail and have all the pieces fit together. But you know, I'm a paid skeptic, I like to say, not a cynic, but a skeptic. And so really, basically, I'm never going to believe anyone to the point where I'll put it in the Boston Globe until we can prove it or come awful close. So I thought it was interesting, but I was not, by no means was I 100% there.
Mm-hmm. So there are very few reporters, frankly, who've written as many in-depth stories about the Catholic Church as you. I mean, Mike was part of the team that won the Pulitzer Prize for uncovering the clergy sex abuse scandal back in 2002. Having said that, how much had you really thought about the possibility that there were lots of children out there whose dads were priests?
I had not thought very deeply about it, quite honestly. And what really amazes me about this story in hindsight, and I think we came upon this realization fairly early in the decision-making process as to whether we were going to do this story or not. And by the way, we don't make that decision very lightly on the Spotlight team. But what really impressed me is that there was this history of scandal. This became apparent pretty early in the research. There was this history of scandal of priests, bishops, cardinals, and even popes having children that reached back all the way to the Renaissance and earlier. And yet, when we did the research, we found that no one had ever written about this in any detailed way. There'd been a few stories about it, but they were they were sort of opinion stories. They weren't based on real reporting and real research. There was one piece that was just pretty academic. There was no flesh and blood on it, but no one really had done this story. And it's a story, honestly, we can say now, that's been sitting there in plain sight for almost 900 years, which is to say as long as the Catholic Church has had a hard and fast celibacy requirement for priests. And I think that's one of the most remarkable things about this story, is that it's been sitting there in plain sight for so long and no one has ever taken it on before.
And also, the Church itself hasn't really taken it on. They've always grappled with it as one scandal at a time, and they don't really have, after 900 years, a policy of what do you do when a priest strays and fathers a child. I want to ask you, like, you talk to a lot of people whose parents are Catholic priests. Like, what is it like to be the son or daughter of a man of the cloth who chooses God over you?
Well, I think one thing that all the children of priests that I've talked to, I mean, all of their stories are very different, but something they all have in common is that they feel that the Church is acting as if they don't exist. You know, one thing we discovered is in the volumes of canon law. Canon law is the body of laws and rules and principles that the Church uses to govern the Catholic world. And we discovered that there's not one word in all of Catholic law that refers to the children of priests. In other words, there's nothing that says what a priest should do if he fathers a child. There's nothing that says what a bishop should do in the way of disciplining a priest or accounting for a priest's children. Zero. So I think the children of Catholic priests, they feel as if the Church is pretending that they don't exist. And it's a very hard feeling to grapple with, I think, for most of them.
And some of these folks, they felt like they had to keep it a secret. I mean, can you talk a little bit like, you know, Chiara Villar? She's one of the people you spent a lot of time with.
Yes, I mean, the burden of secrecy, I think, is very heavy on the children of priests who learn that their fathers are priests early in life, either from the time they're toddlers or perhaps during adolescence. But often the priest is trying to keep the fact that he has become a father secret. And very often the priest is able to enlist the mother in this pact of secrecy. Sometimes the priest will threaten to withhold child support if the mother reveals that they have had a child together. And inevitably the child, the son or the daughter, is brought into this sort of conspiracy of silence. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of pressure put on these children to cover up for their fathers and to tell people outside the family that he's an uncle or just a friend of the family. So essentially the child is being told that there's a very big lie at the center of their lives, and even though they're told that they're not supposed to lie, that lying is wrong, they have to lie all the time about something as important as who their father is. And it takes an emotional and psychological toll on them very often.
So potentially, how many children are there of Catholic priests living today around the world?
Well, there's no hard data on this, and there needs to be hard data. But because I talked to Vincent Doyle. Vincent Doyle is a guy in Galway who is the son of a priest and created a website called Coping International. And Vincent put up this website only a couple of years ago, and already he's heard from scores of children of priests from all over the world, countries all over the world, more than 100 countries all over the world. And so we have some data. It's very sketchy still, but we do have some data that shows that this is indeed a systemic phenomenon, that it exists all over the world. Everywhere the Catholic Church has a presence. So I think we've gone from this being a situation where it's anecdotal, or people think it's anecdotal, to showing that it is systemic and global in nature.
That's an interesting point. And they're actually, on the issue of how many of these children are there, there was a whole behind-the-scenes discussion amongst us and other editors and reporters about, well, how bold should we be in making any kind of a prediction? I mean, we know there are 400,000 clergy around the world that are, the Catholic clergy, and we know that there are estimates that as many as 30% of them may stray from their vows and have an intercourse with women. So the potential is rather vast for unwanted pregnancies to come out of that, but we didn't want to press it too hard because we don't ultimately know how many there are. We just know it wasn't that hard once Mike started looking to find lots and lots of them. They were just coming in steadily to you.
That's right. And another indication that this is a global phenomenon is 3 years ago, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child conducted a big investigation into clergy sex abuse, and they issued a very, very blistering report on the Catholic Church. But in this report, the United Nations Committee said they had also gathered a lot of evidence about Catholic priests who had had children and were extorting secrecy from the mothers of these children, again by threatening to withhold child support if the mothers did not keep their parentage a secret. So the United Nations has formally asked the Vatican to assess the problem and try to figure out how many children of Catholic priests there are around the world, and to make sure they're being cared for financially and emotionally, and also to make sure that authorities in the Church put an end to the practice of priests extorting secrecy from the mothers of their children. I think if the United Nations did not think this was a global phenomenon, they would not be formally involved in making this very formal request to the Vatican.
So I'm Scott Allen. I'm the projects editor for the Boston Globe. This is my colleague Mike Rezendes, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the Globe Spotlight team, and he's the author of a new series that's just come out today and yesterday, Father, My Father, about the children of Catholic priests. If you want to read it yourself, if you haven't seen it yet, go to globe.com/children of priests. And we welcome your questions. We're sitting here. I'm going to quiz Mike a little hard myself, but if you guys want to chime in, be my guest.
Yeah, we actually have a question from Brett Broman. What percentage were teen/underage women or girls?
Good question.
Yeah, it is a very good question. And anecdotally, I heard of situations where some of the mothers were teenagers who were taken advantage of by priests. None of those women were factored in my story because we couldn't really get to the bottom of those stories. The only stories you'll read about in the Boston Globe are stories that we could really document or had a lot of on-the-record testimony about. Very often, the mothers were young when they met these priests or they met seminarians. But I have to say also, it's not just that the priests might have taken advantage of younger women. I think very often the relationships were consensual, and the children were a surprise that suddenly had to be dealt with. So I think many of these women were genuinely in love with the priest at one time or another. So I think these relationships happen in a lot of different ways. And that's part of what's so interesting about the story. But what's uniform, the common denominator, is when the children are born, the couple tries to keep it secret more often than not.
And even where the women are of age and they are entirely consenting to the relationship, there's often a rather large gap in stature between the priest, who is a respected member of the community, and the women who, as you say, are often very young. I mean, Kowalski's mother, I mean, she was, 18 years old?
Yes.
And he was like 40,
yeah.
And he was able to tell her what to do, and she absolutely did it. She was not going to challenge him.
Right. And actually, I'm reminded, as far as a specific question goes, we do have in the story, we mentioned that there was a scandal in Paraguay where the president of Paraguay, who formerly had been a bishop, there was a woman who filed a lawsuit saying that the president of Paraguay had taken advantage of her and impregnated her when she was 16 years old, and he was a bishop, and she was studying for her confirmation under his so-called guidance. So there's one specific example of what the questioner is asking about that we did report in day one of the series.
Mike, one of the bigger themes of the project is that these adults, these children, are in some sense victims of church practices, victims to some degree of the way they handle celibacy as a requirement for the clergy. Can you explain a little more about what you mean by that?
Sure. The church, as I said, almost 900 years ago, made celibacy a requirement for Catholic priests. And this was a tradition that had been gathering momentum literally for centuries, probably since the 3rd or 4th centuries, very early in the history of the Catholic Church. So this was made a requirement of all priests in the 1100s, and the idea was that celibacy would mean that priests could dedicate their lives more fully to the church and the people it serves. The idea was that the priest's wife would be the church. It was also an attempt to have priests emulate the life of Jesus. Catholics believe that Jesus Christ was a virgin, never had sex. So the church instituted this requirement, and I think what happens is we've come through all these hundreds of years where priests continually stray and have relationships with women and have children, and now we come into the contemporary era when we understand a lot more about human sexuality than people ever did. Now we have at least some research that shows how difficult it is. Some would say unnatural, some might say inhuman, to impose celibacy on a young man in his 20s or younger if they're in the seminary. Unfortunately, the church seems very resistant to dealing with this question, to having to having an open conversation about it. So I think, in that sense, that the children of priests are victims of an institution that won't even discuss a centuries-old requirement that is in some degree responsible for the plight of these people who have grown up emotionally, spiritually, and financially deprived very often.
So 15 years ago, you wrote hundreds of stories about the clergy sex abuse crisis. Now 15 years later, you're writing about another kind of scandal, children who are living in the shadows because their fathers are priests. Can you compare between those two experiences? Are there similarities between the sex abuse crisis and what we're talking about now, the secret children of priests?
Sure, I think there are several similarities, and it was impossible to not note them as I was reporting the story. One is just the secrecy that's involved, just the taboo nature of these phenomenon, at least from the experience of those in the Catholic Church. You know, when we got into investigating clergy sex abuse, we found that there had been previous scandals. The Globe Spotlight team did not discover clergy sexual abuse, not by any stretch of the imagination. What we did is we connected the dots, and we got the church's internal documents that proved there was a cover-up. But the refusal to deal with the situation in an open way, the refusal to connect the dots and understand that this wasn't just a series of scandals that had nothing to do with one another, that these were signs of something that was systemic. You know, that phenomenon exactly exists when it comes to the children of Catholic Church, children of Catholic priests. The Church seems to want to pretend that this is not happening, when in fact it's happening all the time, all over the world. The other similarity, I think, is the toll that secrecy takes on the victims of clergy sex abuse and the children of Catholic priests. There's just a toll taken by having to be secret about something so important in your life. And the other part of it is because there's so much secrecy, the victims of clergy sex abuse very often believe that they were alone and were somehow responsible for the abuse that they had endured, and therefore they were very reluctant to come forward. It was only later, after the Globe Spotlight team stories, when victims realized this was a systemic problem, that they were not alone, and it gave them the courage to come forward and speak out about what had happened to them and file lawsuits. And I think the same is true when it comes to the children of Catholic priests. Both Jim Graham, the main subject of the Day 1 story, and Vincent Doyle, the subject of the Day 2 story, both of them told me that when they realized that they were the sons of Catholic priests, they thought they were unique. They thought they were alone. They had no idea that there were so many people all over the world, and probably in their own hometowns, that had had similar experiences.
So talk a little bit about Vincent Doyle. Sometimes an issue just has one person more than anything else. They get identified with it, and he has really made this his cause. And he, in many ways, was dissimilar to the other victims, or they're the children of Catholic priests. Can you talk about Vincent and the kind of person he is and what he brought to this issue?
Sure. I think Vincent is unique in a couple of ways. Maybe the first is he is a practicing Catholic, and he has a theology degree, and he even spent a year in a seminary in Spain studying to be a priest. So this is a guy who really loves his Catholicism. Discovered he was the son of a priest, I guess maybe 5 years ago, when he was 28 years old. And what happened with Vincent is he met someone else by coincidence, a woman who was the daughter of a Catholic priest. And there had been a couple of big scandals in Ireland, one involving a bishop, the other involving a very well-known priest who had had children. So Vincent got to wondering, well, gee, just how many children of Catholic priests are there? And this is a guy who has an advanced degree, so he did some research and soon discovered there was very little out there. And so he did what any enterprising person living in the year 2014 would do, which is to set up a website. And so he set up this website, Coping International, and he didn't put his name on it. There was very little, there was nothing really in the way of any identifying information on it. And the website was pretty simple, and all it basically did was invite people who were the children of Catholic priests to contact the website and give some information about whether they were looking for any sort of support. And very soon, Vincent began hearing from people all over the world, and really that's probably why we're doing this story. If it weren't for the website and the evidence that this was a global phenomenon, we probably would not have written this story.
That's really interesting, because Vincent really comes across, if you read the second day of the series, Vincent is much more of like a happy warrior. He may reject that label, but he compared to a lot of the others, that's the way he comes across, because a number of these folks became terribly disaffected with the church. They felt like they were victims of a very large hypocrisy, and they didn't want to be part of a church that treated people like that.
Right, and who can blame them?
Take with the Perrys, Jim and Emily Perry. Their father, unbeknownst to them, was a priest, and he had abandoned their mother when she overdosed on sleeping pills, and she died. So this is their father. He has a hand in their death, and they're terribly bitter.
Well, yes, and just to elaborate on that story, they discovered that the man who was their father played a role in their mother's death, but it wasn't just that. They also discovered that the priest who was their father, Father James D. Foley, he confessed to Cardinal Bernard Law and also to one of Cardinal Law's top bishops, John McCormick. And he confessed all of this. Mm-hmm. And the response of Cardinal Law and Archbishop McCormick, he's now an archbishop, was to allow Father Foley to continue working as a priest. And so for the next 9 years, until this information was released inadvertently, I have to say, by the church. So the Perrys, they discovered not only was their father a priest, not only did he play a role in their mother's death, but the church hierarchy never did anything about it. And I think this it's really crushed the faith that Jim and Emily had in the Catholic Church. Both of them told me they're still believers. They're still very spiritual people, but they're just not involved with the Catholic Church anymore. And of course, as I said, who can blame them?
Sure. So you actually took a long time researching this story. It took a long time to get this information together. And we did not sneak up on the church hierarchy. You walked in the front door. How was the reaction from the church? How helpful were they in terms of putting the story together?
Well, here in Boston, the Archbishop is Cardinal Sean O'Malley. And Cardinal Sean O'Malley is a very influential cardinal. He's what they call C9, meaning that he's one of the 9 cardinals in Pope Francis's cabinet. He also is the head of the Pope's Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. This is kind of a blue ribbon panel that the Pope set up maybe 3 years ago to try to come up with some policies that would prevent clergy sexual abuse. So I went to the Archdiocese very, very early in my research, several months ago. and I did not speak to Cardinal O'Malley. But I laid out the entire story for one of his staff people, and I said that we'd be very interested in talking to Cardinal O'Malley. We'd love to sit down with him. We'd love to get his thoughts. And months went by, literally months went by, and Cardinal O'Malley decided he was not going to talk to the Boston Globe, even though he's the Archbishop of Boston, and the Boston Globe is the paper of record. And he did give us a statement, and he expressed his own personal views on the subject. And Cardinal O'Malley said that in his view, if a priest fathers a child, he should step away from his ministry and take responsibility for his children. It's an opinion that I think is very much in keeping with some of the things Pope Francis has said. He also told us that the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors is not going to take up this issue, even though one of the commission members made a formal request that the commission look into this, and the request seemed to be moving forward, at least on a preliminary basis. Instead, Cardinal O'Malley said that the commission is going to restrict its work to clergy sex abuse and referred the matter back to the Holy See. So we did get his personal view. We did get the news that the Pontifical Commission is not going to take up this issue. But I do think it's unfortunate that he would not sit and elaborate on his point of view.
I mean, certainly they could have been a much bigger part in framing what we wrote and said, but they chose not to. And for those of you who don't follow Catholic bureaucracy and politics, the Pontifical Commission is a very important body that O'Malley leads, looking at the rights and protections of children in the wake of the sex abuse crisis. They decided that they did not want to consider the children of priests as part of their deliberations for whatever reason, even though there were some members of the commission that certainly thought, well, isn't that part of the welfare of children as well? So I do want to say to the audience,
oh no, I was just saying, there was another question from our audience, from Susan Currier Bailey. Do you think the church will give the children of priests counseling like they did for abuse victims?
What do you think?
Well, I think it's possible. I think it's entirely possible. I think particularly when the Vatican puts together its response to the United Nations, I would not be surprised if there is some provision in there to offer counseling to the children of Catholic priests. I would hope they do something like that.
But in some ways, that could be important for some people. There may be a larger issue here of just as a body, they need to address this in some fashion so that it's not always dealt with as an isolated incident. So some kids get an okay deal because their fathers provide financial support. Others are kept in secret and don't get anything at all. So the lack of uniformity is striking in how much the church has failed to come to grips with it. So it feels like there's something bigger than just counseling for some of the kids themselves.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's very true.
So I do want to just give you one last chance. If there are other questions out there, we are happily fielding them left, right, and center. Mike Rezendes, Boston Globe Spotlight Team, the author of Father, My Father, about the children, the secret children of Catholic priests. So the stories have rolled out over the last couple of days, Wednesday and Thursday, and been widely read. You were on CBS News talking about it as well. What kind of reaction are you getting? What's the feedback you're getting?
Well, the reaction I'm getting is overwhelmingly positive from people inside the church, from Catholics who love the church and just feel that the church should assume a responsibility here, assume a responsibility for some of the results of its policies or the lack of policies. And I think here we're dealing with a situation where there's a lack of any policy for what to do when a priest fathers a child. So overall, folks have been very, very appreciative. I have to say, as you might imagine, I've heard from a lot of people who are the children of Catholic priests or know someone who's the son or daughter of a Catholic priest with a situation they'd like to discuss. And I'm going to be going through all of those responses, the ones that have been sent to me personally and the ones that have been sent to the Globe Spotlight team through the Globe website on globe.com, where you can read both stories.
That's actually a really good point. On the stories that you can see at globe.com/children of priests, there is a box you can click on to tell your story. So we're actually quite interested to hear from people that may have shared some of these same experiences. Perhaps you think, a parent, your father is actually a Catholic priest. We'd love to hear from you. And Mike is personally reading through all of that stuff. I'm happy if you've got anything more that you'd like to add. Is there any kind of a takeaway message you'd like people to bring from the series?
Sure. I just like to say that on behalf of all the sons and daughters of Catholic priests that I interviewed, they're all just really remarkable and wonderful people. All of their stories are very, very different. But what they all have in common is, they've really suffered, either emotionally or spiritually or financially. And I think the fact that they've had to keep their lives secret is part of the reason they've suffered. And all I can say is I hope that what people take away from this is that the Catholic Church needs to address the situation in one way or another.
Thank you for that. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this Facebook Live conversation. We've really enjoyed having your time today, and we'll do it again real soon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.